generation after generation of Palestinians are born outside of the region, outside of Gaza, outside of West Bank, and they still call themselves refugee.
But you also have a very positive attitude towards that. Do you understand why there's people who would be like, same shoes as you? My father's father lived here and his father's father lived here, and damn it, like if I was driven out, the minute I can get a chance to go back, I'm going back.
Of course.
Yeah.
Do you think, I have actually a piece that I wrote about my father on 9/11 did something I never thought he could or would.
What was that?
So my father never learned proper English. He was always sitting on this balcony in Kew Garden Hills, in Forest Hills, New York. And from the balcony, he had this sliver of a view to the New York City skyline. And he would sit on this balcony for years composing poems about how much he missed Iran, day after day. Wow. So I'm not talking about, one or two or three or four or five things. I'm talking about books and books that my father wrote in Persian about his love of Iran. And it used to frustrate the hell out of me. Because I used to come home and I would say, what did you do? And he sat, on the balcony as opposed to, go out and discover this new beautiful world. He sat on the balcony and he composed poetry about how much he missed Iran and how much nothing, not the smell of the air in New York, not the taste of food in New York, not the look of the fruit in New York, was ever as good or as beautiful or as satisfying as the things he knew in Iran. So, as immigrants, we have choices to make. You either reconcile and you say, this is a new reality and I'm going to get along, or you can be, which is, I guess, my experience in some ways, or you can be my dad and say, that's it, everything else, nothing matters except for the things I've lost, right? So just to bring it to sure. The earlier note I made is that, I thought he didn't like America or didn't love America. And then on 9/11, my father, who hardly could see anything because he had macular degeneration, walked out of the apartment. And about 3 hours later, he had bought the biggest American flag I'd ever seen in my life be sold on a, in a regular store, dollar store, and hung it on the balcony rails. And I was so touched, to the point that I thought, maybe I never understood, what my father did or thought. But my point being that, yes, you can keep dreaming, but there comes, and you can keep writing about it, and you can keep dreaming about it, and you can write in history books about injustices that happen to you, and those things are perfectly fine. But the history of the world is that we make agreements and people move on. And whether it's Pakistan and India or North Korea or South Korea, we make partitions, we come up with, UN decisions and agreements or whatever contracts, and we abide by those contracts. And the only exception to all of these contracts and agreements and universal settlements is the case of Israel.
You think it's the only one? I would say there's still, for example, extreme dislike between North Korea and South Korea. That's just one off the top
but
of my
nobody's
head.
saying, let's return North Korea to South Korea. Yeah, everybody wants it to be reunited, right?
North Korea does want South Korea, though.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But the rest of us in the world aren't sitting in America saying, down to South Korea.
Right.
Or, let's eradicate Pakistan because it really belongs to India. We are saying, whatever it was, it's for them, let them sort it out. It's now history.
I think part of the issue here is the recency of this one, this being 1948. It's the post-World War II world.
Well, Korea is 50s.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. But I'm saying, like, if we're bringing it back to why this one is such at the forefront, like Korea, they fought a war over it. We were in the war as well. And then once the war ended, like, okay, this is what it is. And we can argue about whether or not there's still distaste there on each side. It's a different story. In the Middle East, like, those are two countries that formed in Korea. Okay? North Korea is obviously a dictatorship hellhole. South Korea is at least not that. In Israel-Palestine, you basically had an Israeli government form, and then Palestine, which had been under British rule, didn't form a government.
Because it refused to.
What do
There
you
was
mean
a
it refused to?
partition. So,
Yeah.
so twice there were agreements to partition the land. The first time around in the 30s, where the UN agreed, or actually it was
League of Nations.
League of Nations and other international agreements gave 20% of the land in, I think it was in the late 30s, I forget the exact date, and then 80% of the land to the Palestinians, and they refused. And then the second time around, it was after World War II, and the agreement, the partition, was to do nearly 40-60 between Israel and Palestine.
Right.
Israel agreed. The Palestinians didn't.
Because they're giving up, but here's the argument, though. They're giving up what's theirs.
Right.
That's how they view it. They're like, but we have 100%. Why would we give up 20?
Right.
Right. But we have 100%. Why would we give up 40? I understand that.
Right. Of course. But, every partition, somebody loses and somebody gains. And, this has happened throughout history. It wasn't happening for the first time. And that's the exception, that Israel is the exception. Generation after generation of Palestinians are born outside of the region, outside of Gaza, outside of West Bank, and they still call themselves refugee. And these are the only people in the world who can hang on to that title, right? But other people, including myself and hundreds of thousands of other Jews who've been driven out of various Muslim countries throughout the region, throughout the Middle East and North Africa, have moved, whether to Israel or to Europe. We don't consider ourselves refugees anymore, because you can't keep being a refugee, once you naturalize and resettle in another country, and your kids who are born here can't claim to be refugees anymore. So what I'm trying to say is that the entire system, whether it's UN or within the Arab world, has set up this expectation that Israel cannot exist, even with the agreement that the UN issued in 1948 as a piece of partitioned land, and it, so the idea is that Israel has to be eradicated, whether it's in the echoes of slogans that we hear on the streets of New York, from the river to the sea, or in the fundamental idea that Jews have to be eliminated, or from Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, that said during his first term of presidency that Israel has to be wiped off the map of the world. Israel remains the exception that needs to be eradicated, and Palestinians remain the one and only people in the world whose refugeehood gets passed on from generation to generation, from country to country, no matter where they go.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I see how it was set up to be a lose-lose at the beginning. I also, I've talked a lot about the Kurds on different episodes of the show. There are people that still have no country. There's 30 million of them.
I wrote about them. My second book is about the assassination of the Kurdish leaders in Berlin, Germany.
Yeah, too. So you're obviously well-versed and well aware in that.
And I love them, and I feel very crazy. Close to them. That is crazy.
Like they should have their own land somewhere. But to your point, that means someone technically has to lose, right? Like the border's got to be redrawn somewhere.
Like Turkey or Syria
Sure.
or, Iranians or
Yeah.
Iraqis.
Probably all four in a way, if you look at where the Kurds are. And that would also create a huge problem. So it's like it was set up that way, and the Jews didn't have their own land for the longest time, and they did have like an old school historical stake to this. Now, like if you hear Netanyahu talk about it, he's like, imagine you were kicked out of your apartment and one day you come back and you say, I want my apartment back. It's your apartment. I'm like, yes.
That's
in
good,
theory.
Netanyahu.
Oh, thank you. But yes, in theory, that's right. But that apartment kick out happened 1,300 years ago or 1,200 years ago at the time you go to take the apartment back. So
I can't do the Netanyahu voice, but there were Jews who were still living in Palestine.
Yes,
even after they've
That's
been
true.
driven out. So
I think it was as much. Maybe we can check this, Alessia. I don't want to get shit wrong. I'm sure
a
the comments will tell
few
us.
percents. Yeah.
I want to say it was close to 10%. It was like 8 to 10%, somewhere in
And
there.
by the way, now that we are doing this, they were considered second-class citizens in Palestine, which is
Oh, I believe that.
yeah,
believe
because
that.
under Ottoman rule, which is the rule, those who ruled in Palestine prior to the British, Jews were second-class citizens and were considered dhimmis by Islamic laws. So imagine you're the native people
Right.
in the land, and the leadership considers you second-class citizens, as if we told the Native Americans or
That's what I was gonna
Indian
say.
Americans.
Right. So what
So
if
say it.
what if
Yeah.
I think about this possibility all the time because you look at the history, some of the stuff that happened to Native Americans is terrible. Not even subjectively, just
Right.
objectively, it's absolutely terrible. And they still have a population here.
Yeah.
What if, 5 years from now, something happened in the world and the Native Americans rose up and said, this is no longer the United States of America. We have, total claim to this land. I'm not disagreeing that the front end of that, they did. And a lot of shit happened, people lost, and unfortunately they lost. But, like, as an American, I wouldn't be happy about that if they, like, rose up and ended the country.
Mm-hmm.
But could you say that we had it coming? I don't know. It's a very strange thing to try to plot out and think about in your head.
Right. But again, that's the history of human civilization.
Mm-hmm.
I happen to be working on a new book project that deals with events that took place in Iran in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And in the process of researching this book, damn it, I found out. I mean, it's not that I didn't know. It's just that I learned it as a kid in school, but I'm now revisiting these facts as an adult. And so they struck me in a way that they never had before. Nearly 1/3 of the entire Iranian region was lost in the beginning of the 19th century to Russia. So all of these, Tajikistan and all of these, Caucasus used to be Iranian owned.
And now they're friends with them.
I mean, friends or no friends, but to think that some of the richest, culturally, geographically most diverse, interesting parts of the country were lost to Russia. And then, a lot of the rest of it was lost to the British Empire. So, map of the world has been changing. If you look at how human beings have moved and big populations have crossed borders and borders have, expanded and shrunk and expanded and shrunk, you'd realize that this is how history takes shape.
Yeah. My friend Eric Zuliger says countries are just stories, right? And borders are these lines that get drawn to make the story make sense.
Yeah.
And it's very true because you know, you can look at the map even with a recency bias of the last 150 years, for example, and see all the changes that have occurred and all the places that didn't used to be this way that now are this size or shrunk down to this size or whatever. And as we've been saying over the last 30 minutes, it's like that means that, yes, there are winners and losers with that stuff. And sometimes it was just like basically almost a monkey throwing a dart at the board when you talk about like Britain and France and I think it's the Sykes-Picot Agreement, just like randomly, they're not even involved. And they're like, yeah, we'll just carve up this country here, carve up that country there. It's not even fair, but like that's how it went down. And we learned to accept that order. So I think there's a way we could. What it's always felt like, though, is that I understand in 1948 Palestinians having an issue with their land being given up, and then it gets worse because then there's a war. But ever since then, you know, you've had all these things happen where Israel does get the upper hand, and the Palestinians aren't able to have a military. And basically, what I'm getting at is, you do kind of make it ripe to have a self-fulfilling prophecy where some sort of violent organization will take the power vacuum if you don't allow an actual system of government to be set up. So what do you think that's a part of the strategy that they should change? And maybe for the West Bank and even Gaza, which are geographically separated, you know, you could have Israel recognize some sort of state there to where they are able to form their own government and military where it's not associated obviously with PLO or Hamas?
There's a clip of a President Clinton speech that is circulating on the internet, and it's been circulating even more after October 7th, where he says that he struck
He had
an agreement where 90% of everything that the Palestinians had ever wanted was given to them. And with the 3% agreed to be given to them, you know, under some other arrangement. And they didn't sign a contract. They didn't agree. And so what I am trying to say...
Yeah, can we play this clip so people can see it?
Sure.
Let's do that to give them context. Let me hear it, Les.
Yeah. Like with the Palestinian, when I tell the young people, for example, who are understandably in America, let's say they're super sympathetic with the Palestinians, well, they've been killed. A lot of those Palestinians have, and all they know is a lot more Palestinians have been killed than Israelis. And I tell them what Arafat walked away from. And they can't believe it. I said, oh yeah, he walked away from a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem, 96% of the West Bank, 4% of Israel to make up for the 4% that the settlers occupy that were beyond the borders in the 67 war. And I go through all the stuff that was in the deal, and they it's not on their radar screen. They can't even imagine that happened.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.